Hello and welcome to the latest Bristol University Press webinar on reimagining the prison system. I'm Lisa White, I'm Senior Lecturer in Criminology at Liverpool John Moores. I'm also part of the editorial collective of the European Group for the Study of Deviance and Social Control's Journal of Justice, Power and Resistance, which is due to be relaunched by Policy Press in the very near future. Today, I'm really delighted that you're all here, and I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. We've got Martin Glynn, who is a criminologist and Winston Churchill Fellow and author of Reimagining Black Art and Criminology, a New Criminological Imagination. He's over 35 years experience of working in criminal justice, public health and educational settings, and Martin is currently a lecturer in Crim at Birmingham City University. We've also got Kirstine Szifris, who is Research and Evaluation Lead at Shift UK, a youth justice charity, and author of Philosophy Behind Bars, Growth and Development in Prison. Kirstine is a criminologist with 10 years experience in research and evaluation. We also have Lambros Fatsis, who is a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Brighton and co-author of Policing the Pandemic, How Public Health Becomes Public Order, with Melania Lam, who is due to be with us today but couldn't make it. Lambros is also the author of The Public and Their Platforms, along with Mark Carrigan, and his research fuses cultural criminology with Black radical thought, focusing on police racism and the criminalisation of Black music subculture. And last but no means least, we've got Andrew Coyle, who is Emeritus Professor of Prison Studies at the University of London, and following a career as a prison governor, he became founding director of the International Centre for Prison Studies at King's College London, and he spent many years advising national governments and international agencies on prison-related issues in over 70 countries. So I've got a few housekeeping things to run through before we start. Each of our panellists will speak for around 8 minutes. I apologise to the speakers, but I need to be quite strict with this. After we've spoken, you'll have time for questions and answers. Please type your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll put them to the panellists at the end of the session. If you've any technical issues, then please use the chat. And we've also got closed captions enabled on this webinar. There's a button at the bottom of your screen, CC Live Transcript. Please use this to show or hide the text as you prefer. Details of how to order our panellist books at half price will be available here too. Use the code PRISONS50 at checkout. A recording of the webinar will be available after the event. Okay, so this webinar is taking place at what I feel is a really important time. Last year marked a record number of deaths in prison in England and Wales, and as we speak, over 80,000 people are currently incarcerated in that particular system alone. Rates of self-harm remain high, with over 52,000 recorded incidents last year, and if we take recidivism as a measure of success, then our use of prison raises questions around that too. So similar patterns can be seen elsewhere. So the eternal question must therefore again be asked, can our use of prison be reimagined? And if so, what would that involve? So with that in mind, I'd like to hand over to Martin to begin our session. Martin.
Yes, greetings everybody. Basically, I'm going to kind of present more of a provocation. This time last week, I was in Leicester and I received a Lifetime Achievement Award for services to the community and racial justice, total of 41 years. And that moment has kind of forced me to go right back to the beginning of my 40 odd years of working in prisons, on the streets, but specifically with an emphasis on the issue of race and the racialization of criminal justice. When we look here, when we look in North America, the kind of disproportionate representation through the whole of the criminal justice system has led to mass incarceration. Back in 2014, I concluded my doctorate. I had worked for 25 years as a practitioner in prisons and wanted to continue the work intellectually to look at desistance. And I remember when I did that, I was looking at what role does prison play in enabling Black men in particular to desist. And what it came out at, it was almost an impossibility. So when we look at the recidivism rate, when we look at race within the criminal justice system and blocked opportunity in the social structure, it was a problem. So postdoctorally, I continued and still continue to engage with Black men. Only yesterday, a father phones me and said, Martin, my two boys have just been given 24-year sentences and 11 respectively. The week before that, I had another father phoning me saying my son's got a life sentence. So it's constant. So what's this got to do with reimagining the criminal justice system? Well, 3 years ago when George Floyd was murdered, I was watching it. And when I was watching the video, I then saw the graffiti image. I then noticed that hip hop artists, and I noticed that gospel singers and R&B singers, I noticed that Black artists were responding to this particular moment and actually had more impact in mobilizing the community through Black Lives Matter and people like myself who are outside of that, to look critically at policing George Floyd. And I went back and I looked at the issue, and I thought that artists are better placed to represent my reality than sometimes criminology or sociology as a discipline. So I wrote a book, which Bristol University published, about reimagining criminology as a discipline told through the lens of Black art. Well, recently, 18 months ago, I had another commission from Routledge. I, over a period of about 5 years, amassed 20,000 court transcripts, documents, which demonstrated the Black presence in crime and punishment from 1750 to 1900. When I went back out into the community and I started to share this information beyond Black History Month, what I realized is the huge psychological and emotional impact of the acknowledgement that Black people were there in the Georgian period, in the Victorian period, that not a lot is known about. So when I started looking at the role of Black art, and then I looked at the role of history within crime and punishment, and went back to some of the constituents that I've worked with over the years who've desisted from crime, lo and behold, the intersection between history and art, Black art, became a reality. Many of the people that I've worked with over the years who've been to jail found comfort when I used to bring Black history, Black politics, cultural responsive approaches to teaching in prison. So one of my feelings is right now within contemporary rehabilitative processes, within the study of desistance and reentry, because I can't separate, in terms of my work around race and prisons, I can't divorce the prison reality from re-entering the community and ultimately desistance. It's a continuum. And what I've realized when I go back to my constituency and I've interrogated them and said, what are the things that enable you to desist? And they said that once they could locate themselves within a historical context as offenders and non-offenders, and if they could express that and explore that through creativity, whether it's through music, theatre and art, it's enabled them to process, do some healing, respond effectively, which has terminated their offending. So from my point of view, in the second of my, or the third and fourth books that I've done, I've begun to turn my attention to the way that criminology represents or misrepresents the reality of race, racialization, historically, culturally, and politically within prisons. What I discovered in the 17th and 1800s, there were Black people in prisons, but there were Black people who were prison reformers in the 17 and 1800s. And that's never been reflected. When I started to look at everything in British history, from the Chartist movement, from various social movements in the Georgian and the Victorian period, in the history books that I've read, and certainly criminology, there's no hint of it. So I wanted to move away from just focusing on the acres of research that's been done with Black men in particular and race, What I wanted to focus on is the role of the discipline that's made a lot of claims about prisons, that's made a lot of claims about rehabilitation. And my argument is, and why it's a provocation, that if you are theorizing about a diverse community in prison and you're omitting scholarship from all 7 continents, whether it's indigenous, whether it's African-American, African, Black, British, then much of the claims that people are making within that context of prison is inaccurate. And that's not just in a British context, that's in a wider European context. We've seen this in Ukraine, where thousands of Africans have been studying in Ukraine. There is thousands of mixed race children that have been abandoned as a consequence of this war, but it's never been mentioned in the press. So therefore, my question is to the discipline. If claims are being made about reimagining, where does the issue of race, racialization fit in the way that we reimagine? Because currently as it stands, the disproportionate representation of Black people in the British, England and Wales prison system is astronomically high. In the States, goes without saying, and if you travel around the world, you'll see that Black people are one of the most over-incarcerated groups. And that's not as a consequence of Black people committing more crime. It's just the racialization of criminal justice treats Black people harsher at every stage of the criminal justice system. So I suppose the provocation is, if we're going to reimagine prisons, how do we address the structural inequality that creates mass incarceration and is beginning to do that in the UK? So finally, in order to be able to start this conversation, what I'm doing in my own work is the intersection between history and Black art, is to look at new platforms to express this. Journals offer Black scholars very little opportunity to be heard in this agenda. So people like myself and a range of us are speaking to filmmakers, platformers, speaking to Netflix, because it requires a global conversation. So therefore, for me, just to kind of conclude on this, having spent 40 odd years in this agenda, I still see very little movement around race, Black people. I've written it to death on it. There's many people, maybe some of the people here have done that. So therefore, for me, reimagining suggests that we have to go back to basics. And what I've discovered in the 1750s, in the 1900s, that those issues were raised in the 1750s. It was Elizabeth I that put a memo out to say there was too many Black people in the country and she wanted to get Black people out, and that was in the 1500s. So what I'm saying is we've had a 100-year history to wrestle with the way that we deal with people who transgress society's rules. So the provocation is more as a call to arms for those people who believe in equity. If you're not representing scholarship, theoretical ideas, and the information from diverse scholars, then a lot of the claims that are being made are false and inaccurate. It doesn't mean that they're not valid, but in order to make it a fuller picture within reimagining, it has to be inclusive, not exclusive. So that's my bit.
Thank you, Martin. That was a really thought-provoking start to our panel session today. I'd like to now pass on to Kirstine Szifris. Thank you.
Thank you for that. It's interesting, a few of the things that Martin said makes me want to have talked about something slightly different in my work, because a key thing that you said, which was really relevant to some of the work that I did, was about the importance of people being able to locate themselves within the history and culture that they come from, which is in part, hopefully these slides are working, was a sort of key finding for my work. But I'll pop a timer on to make sure I don't go over what I'm talking about. So my name's Kirstine Szifris, and I've written this book, Philosophy Behind Bars, Growth and Development in Prison. The work was based on my PhD thesis that involved teaching philosophy in 2 prisons in the UK, in England. Both of them were prisons for people serving very long sentences, Grendon and Full Sutton, one a maximum security, one a therapeutic community. There's a huge amount of information in there, but with the sort of focus of reimagining prisons, I wanted to focus on this concept of identity, which was the overarching theme in the book. That's why it's called Towards Growth and Personal Development as the subtitle. So fundamentally, when we think about reimagining the prison space or the criminal justice system, we have to recognise that prisons are inhabited by people. They centre around people with backgrounds, personal stories and insights that they have into themselves and those around them. In the sort of prison sociological world where I come from, we often talk about the notions of survival. And what we mean by that is the survival of the self in the face of the prison environment. So a survival identity refers to the preoccupation of many prisoners that they have that involves cultivating a persona that will allow them to psychologically survive the prison experience and maintain a sense of self, maintain some kind of pre-prison identity. But for many of them, this is quite an unrealistic goal, particularly when they have very, very long sentences. Some of the men that I worked with had already been in prison for over 30 years. Some were facing over 30 years in prison and were at the beginning of their sentences. So I want to ask what it means, or what it would mean if we were to develop a space where we would allow for the possibility of a growth identity to develop within the prison system and explore the role of philosophy in providing a space for such personal development. So like I said, my research involved doing two things: teaching philosophy in the prison system and also researching it. So my philosophy courses were based around dialogue. So that meant that I came into the prison and we sat in a circle and discussed a range of topics. What does it mean to change? How ought we to live? What does it mean to be human? What is art? Things like that. And we discussed Socrates, Descartes, Kant, Mill, Hume and Arendt, amongst others. And the aim and purpose was simply to develop a community of philosophical inquiry within the prison that would allow us as a group of people to engage in collaborative, non-adversarial conversation around a range of philosophical ideas. The research part of it was ethnographically led, so I immersed myself in the field and I spent quite a lot of time in the prisons and I interviewed staff and prisoners. I took lots and lots of notes and I spent quite a long time trying to cultivate this community or sort of safe space that would allow us to have sort of philosophical conversation. So there were key themes that emerged from the research. These were as follows: forming relationships. So the philosophy classroom provided space to form relationships, developing trust, the ability to actually cultivate in a kind of highly charged environment in the prison, the maximum security in particular. There were very low levels of trust within the prison community and between the prisoners and the prison officers towards me, as well as between each other. But this ability to cultivate a sort of trusting environment, the opportunity to become more open-minded, listening to other people, hearing things from different perspectives and expanding the way that you think about the world. Improved well-being as well, giving them a space to be outside and beyond the prison walls, and provide a space for genuine self-reflection and an opportunity for self-reflection, self-expression, something that is quite rare in the prison environment. So what my work suggested was that it is possible to do things differently and to cultivate a space for growth and personal development within the prison environment. And for people who are in prison, this is important. So these are longer quotes from my books that you don't need to read, but they're just there for reference. But what we found was that the concept of identity was very much at the forefront of people's ways of thinking and ways of being in the prison. In everyday life, we all present different versions of ourselves suitable to a given situation. However, in the prison and in other environments, the kind of survival mask is required in order to survive the prison experience can involve developing kind of a hyper-masculine sense of self that shows no fear or emotion or distress in the face of the prison community. And for many of my prisoners that I worked with, many of the men that I spent time with, that showing no fear or emotion, they were particularly taken with sort of philosophies from the Stoics and Stoicism because of that kind of need to keep a kind of mask where you can cope with the prison environment. Then violence, bullying and sort of deprivation is part of taking the prison experience in your stride and relying on nobody else to get through but yourself to get through the prison day. And the fear expressed by some of my participants was that these kind of cultivated macho selves would gradually become who they are. No longer a front, but an actual expression of the fundamental self, because after 10, 15, 20 years in the prison, without spaces that they can present different versions of the self, this macho front becomes all they know how to be. But what I found was that in the philosophy classroom, the individual can be met as a whole person. And in the prison context, this was quite rare and very important. We've already mentioned desistance, and research from that field has shown us that the change narrative is quite complex and requires opportunity for self-reflection. Identity work, being able to understand the self and spend time maintaining a sense of who you are, involves being able to try out different ways of being in different contexts. But if a person spends all of their time in an environment that encourages or creates a need for a macho front, how can we expect people to develop a different sense of self and a different way of being? Oh, I'm 30 seconds under, so I will leave it there. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Lots to think about there in terms of the meaning of the self and the meaning of survival as well. I'd like to now pass on to Lambros. Lambros, you've got 8 minutes.
Thank you. So I fear that I'm going to be the disagreeable and pleasant troublemaker here, but it's all really in the spirit of love and reality. I promise. So what I intend to do, I guess, in my 8 minutes will probably violate criminological norms, to say nothing of scholarly standards of respectability. So, being a dirty, shameless abolitionist, I sort of want to argue against reimagining prisons and shifting our attention instead to the need for dismantling them altogether. And doing so by inviting us to actually reimagine what safety looks like without them. So before I dive straight into the heart of my abolitionist provocation, I should really stress that what I will be referring to, or rather when I will be referring to prisons, I won't be thinking about them as standalone institutions. Rather, I would like to see them as part of a wider carceral archipelago, as Michel Foucault put it in Discipline and Punish. And this is quite important to point out at the outset, especially as abolitionists insist on using the term prison industrial complex to remind us that prisons are simply the last link in a longer chain of criminalization that usually starts with policing as the opening portal that leads to the cages that we call prisons and jails. So what such a realization compels us to do is to really approach imprisonment and prisons themselves as dependent on logics, tactics, professional and political ideologies that cover the entire span of the legal penal system. It's not just prisons as places of punishment that abolitionists want to disappear, but the very intellectual, legal, sociocultural and political processes that rely on prisons as geographical solutions to social problems, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore put it. So for any of this to make sense, I should add that such calls to tear down walls and put an end to cages where human beings are warehoused require imagining what is thinkable and possible without and beyond prisons, and indeed make what is possible real. So recognizing the obvious fact that if prisons kept people safe and societies crime-free, then their expansion must be seen as a failure of such a goal. Why else would we need to make more room for a building that is supposed to remove a threat rather than accommodate more such threats within its walls? So rather than approaching legal penal institutions as crime-fighting ones, a dangerous myth and a comfortable untruth that has more effective than factual value, the real historical mission, function, and purpose as coercive ordinance, order maintenance institutions, which they actually are, needs to be acknowledged. Otherwise, we will never really allow ourselves to imagine and design safety in ways that do not extend the reach or indeed expand the power of unjust, punitive institutions that socialize us into propping up the punitive security industry rather than achieving ethical community and accountability. And indeed doing so in ways that are collectively and democratically arrived at rather than state imposed. So I guess my concern goes at the heart of abolitionist thinking and organizing, urging us to think about safety and accountability beyond accepting the truth-denying truism that things must be as they are, or pretending that the only solutions to violence and harm have to be located within punitive logics, tactics, and institutions, or that responding to violence and harm can only assume the form of reform that is aimed at merely making oppression more bearable rather than eliminating it altogether. Living with, that is to say, dying from, rather than eliminating COVID comes to mind as an illustrative example, albeit in a slightly different context. So if all this sounds like a conflict between mainstream reformist approaches and oddball abolitionist ruminations, that's exactly what this is. So it might be worth considering, I guess, at this point, which of the two positions kind of sound more ethically just and socially transformative. Reformism essentially calls for more justice within unjust institutions, cautioning them to behave better and in more humane ways, while retaining all their power and legalized, normalized, formalized, and institutionalized tools for inflicting violence through punishment. A series of important questions, therefore, remain unanswered. Who suggests those reforms? Legal penal functionaries, the government, or the communities that are disproportionately targeted and affected by the ever-widening legal penal dragnet? Who benefits from such reforms? The legal penal system, the government, the state, or Black and other racially and otherwise minoritized groups of people who are systemically and systematically marginalized and made vulnerable to harm and state violence too? What is the aim of such reforms? Do they aim to increase the legitimacy of the legal penal system by expanding its power while maintaining a favorable public image? Or do they target social injustice? On the opposite side of the spectrum, abolitionist thinking launches its critique by focusing on social and racial injustice as a default setting rather than a system error. So where reformists devise solutions based on gathering evidence or best practice and fairer outcomes, abolitionists ask what the institutions in question are, what they do, who do they do it to, and who do they do it for, claiming that the way institutions are designed ultimately determines their function. Unless the very logic and purpose of institutions change, superficial solutions that ignore institutional architectures and indeed the political power that shapes them can only deliver cosmetic changes that bring no real change. As Fred Moten and Stefan Ohani put it, what is, so to speak, the object of abolition? Not so much the abolition of prisons, but the abolition of a society that could have prisons, that could have slavery, and therefore not abolition as the elimination of anything, but abolition as the founding of a new society. So such a vision for a new society imagines and crafts expansive somewheres out of nowheres, to paraphrase Jane Cortez, who of course you might know as a jazz vocalist and poet. But such a vision also works hard to disrupt, upset, and show the limitations of existing ways of being in the social world that persist only in the absence of a precondition for their abandonment, as Cedric Robinson put it in the terms of order. So in the hope that much of what I've said sounds hopeful, positive, and reconstructive, I also hope that our thinking and discussions will place public safety, political liberty, and social justice as values that are worth defending beyond and without legalized forms of punishment. Thank you.
Thank you, Lambros, and perfectly timed. Lots to consider there in terms of the meaning of harm, meaning of justice, the role of power and legitimizing different systems. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I would like to frame my presentation within the context of my latest book, Prisons of the World. And the linking thread of that book is my personal journey, which began with over 2 decades working in high security prisons in the UK and has continued by my work in prisons in over 70 countries all around the world. In the book, I describe some of the men and women whom I've met in these prisons. I ask some fundamental questions about the use which we make of imprisonment in many countries today. And I attempt to answer the question, what should be the future of the prison in the 21st century? I've selected a number of countries and regions which demonstrate particular key issues and dilemmas within the prison environment, which are influenced by wider social and political attitudes. I describe what I found, for example, in prisons in Russia and other countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, as they slowly emerged from the terrible legacy of the all-pervasive Gulag system of Soviet times. I describe prisons in China and Japan, where there are soul-crushing levels of discipline and where the movement of every individual is monitored and punishments are harsh. In South African prisons, in the immediate aftermath of the apartheid era, and in other countries in Southern Africa, where there are shocking levels of overcrowding and a lack of basic necessities. I describe prisons in Latin America, which has some of the most lawless prisons in the world, cesspits of violence exacerbated by the deadly influence of all-powerful gangs, with violence which seeps through the prison walls into the communities of the poor and back again. In India, which is one of the lowest rates of imprisonment in the world, yet one of the highest proportions of pre-trial prisoners. I describe Australia and New Zealand, especially in respect of their treatment of Indigenous citizens. And across the wider European region, where there are significant variations, both in the levels of imprisonment, as well as in the nature of its delivery in a number of close neighbours. The book also describes specific problems which exist in many countries. These include an excess of pre-trial and remand prisoners held in intolerable conditions, increasing numbers of mentally ill prisoners in the United Kingdom, men held for years in solitary confinement in the United States, older prisoners in Japan, men and women who commit petty crimes in order to be sent to prison, where they will receive the basic social care which is not available for them in the community. In several European countries, the increasing numbers of foreign national prisoners. And in an important chapter, I describe the experiences of the 7% of the world's prisoners who are women, explaining how those whom I refer to as the silent minority are treated within prison systems that are designed primarily by and for men. Having discussed the futility and failings of the prison in many countries, the final chapter of the book presents some positive pointers for the future, taking up the plea of Václav Havel, former president of the Czech Republic, who wrote to his wife from his prison cell about his experiences and the need to find what he described as a better way of coming to terms with certain things. I go on to suggest that the real change for the wider benefit of society is only likely to come about if many of the resources which are currently invested in the demand-led imprisonment industry are substantially transferred to initiatives such as those which are described as justice reinvestment and the human development model. In the words of the United Nations, these are initiatives which are based on the principle of expanding the richness of human life, rather than simply the richness of the economy in which human beings live. To express that in another way, such an approach will have a positive focus on future improvement, in contrast to the criminal justice approach, which has a retrospective focus on the reduction of crime. And a proper application of this approach could provide a way out of the vicious circle of ever-increasing use of criminal justice systems, which are expensive in fiscal terms, but more importantly, are detrimental in terms of human development. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Again, lots for us to think about there in terms of the costs of imprisonment in a range of different ways. So now we've got about 20 minutes for a question and discussion, folks. So I've had a few questions come in, and the first is open to everybody. Should we be moving towards a positive drugs policy in prison, with the MOJ and HMPPS controlling the supply and type of drugs in prison in order to maintain quality and prevent the victimisation associated with debt and gang involvement in prison? Has anybody got any thoughts on that?
I imagine Andrew's probably, with his experience in the prison, might have the most to say, but I would suggest that they already try and control the supply of drugs into prison, and they seem to be failing. So I'm not sure whether it would work even if they provided what they wanted. But
I mean, if I could come in, I think this is one, it's an important question, but it's a specific example of a more general problem, that one cannot reform any of these what are basic social problems within the very peculiar environment of prisons. You can't expect that people who have come into prison with serious drug problems then somehow can be reformed within the prison, particularly in respect of this question, by a negative approach. I think you have to come at it much earlier down the line before people come into prison. I think the prison system has to do everything it can to reduce the misuse of drugs, but it can't do that in isolation, particularly when there's a movement in and out of the prison, which we would wish to encourage. But this is a specific example of a much more general problem of the closed world of prisons.
Can I also add something? That drugs in prison don't operate in isolation. If you look at county lines as a brand new or a more contemporary version of drug dealing, a lot of it's administrated through jails. So unless you're going to confiscate phones, and they've already tried that. So at the end of the day, unless there's a recognition of the complex nature, working in the inner city and prisons, which is like a boxed in version of the inner city, you also have to negotiate or look at drug dealers. You also look at the supply of drugs. So in some respects, it's complex. if we take the pandemic, people have been locked off for a couple of years. It's led to a lot of anxiety. There's all sorts of social consequences based on the pandemic, which has led people to suffer from more mental health. So the people I work with and I know, and many of those have been involved in drugs, see prison as a site to take advantage of the people in there, but also to make lucrative economic choices whilst they're incarcerated. So when they get out, because the blocked opportunities for a lot of people that sell drugs are not there post-release. So it goes back to a complex, awkward situation. And me personally, historically, I don't see any political will to change that. So if politics is the driver of this kind of change, I don't have that feeling it's going to change. But maybe if there's another strange ways, maybe if we have more riots in the inner city, because those are the only thing, but all they do is get more prisons and the problem intensifies. So I'm not being cynical about it. I'm kind of being more realistic, that it's not just a case of enabling disaffected people in that space. It's also dealing with the whole cultural context of that drugs exist within the wider society, but like what Andrew is saying.
Anybody else? No. Okay, another question for Martin. If arts helps with recidivism, who is going to do that and how? How should it be funded? How could we persuade the government to get behind something like this?
Well, again, I'm probably a bit like Lambros in that sense. I've been involved in delivering arts in prisons for 40 odd years. People get arts in different ways. They get it through the music, they get it through literature, and they read in the library. There's an extraordinary amount of stuff. I was part of the Ann Peaker Centre that's now for the Unit for Arts and Offenders. You go back, if you look at Oscar Wilde, when he wrote some of his work when he was in jail. I mean, prisons are great spaces for people to write, draw, paint, sing, whatever it is. For me, that's not necessarily the issue for me. Within the construction of arts, again, it's, you know, if you look at governors in prison who have discretionary powers to determine who gets what, it differs across from category A to open prisons. For me, it's more about the agreed principle that art, like philosophy, because philosophy and art are very interconnected, extends notions of self to enable someone to question. So in an environment for diversity, indigenous people who have indigenous ways of seeing the world, art is fundamental and should not be barred. So from my perspective, it's not government's job, although government provides resources. This is a rallying cry for artists and communities to play more of a continuity, to give more of a continuity to the role of transforming people inside, on release, and ultimately the desistance. So for me, it's more of an agreed cultural norm, because in our society, violence is accepted as a cultural norm. What I would like to see is art, philosophy, creativity as a cultural norm, that ultimately less people would commit offences, and it's what Lambros was saying, then hopefully prisons would disappear, hopefully. So it's there, but I personally wouldn't advocate to the people I work with to hold your breath that any subsequent government, whether it's Labour, Conservative, Liberal, Democrat, and in America, is going to liberate people with art. And remember Augusto Boal, Theatre of the Oppressed. You know, it took him as an outsider to liberate prisoners. It didn't take the prison authorities. So I think it's artists and the collaboration between other vested interests.
Thank you. And I think that mention of culture leads really nicely on to our next question for Kirstine. How would you suggest we get rid of the macho front culture in prisons in a practical sense?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Martin's just said there, and a lot of the conversations that have been, a lot of the talks that have been presented today, I agree with everything that was said. One of the things about my work is that because I was doing an ethnographic study, the kind of question that I had, or an ethnographically led study, the question I had was, when you're a person who happens to be spending a long time in prison, what does philosophical conversation mean to you in that particular space? And I kind of offered no sort of comment at that point on the rightness or wrongness of the individuals who happen to be spending a period of their time in the prison. And what I found was that prisons cultivate the absolute opposite of what they're intended to cultivate. And there are points where I think we should probably dismantle the system and start again, because it doesn't really work. In terms of having the system we've got now and how to get rid of the macho culture, the practical solutions, I think my work offers a very clear solution, and that is providing space for people to genuinely explore who they are. One of the problems that we have in the prison system is that everything is done through a lens of rehabilitation and reducing offending. The rehabilitation model that we use targets very specific criminogenic issues where people are defined by one small aspect of who they are as a person, which is their offending behaviours. So instead of teaching, you know, we've got research studies that are problematic, but that show we have low levels of literacy, numeracy and thinking skills that can be very much challenged, but that's what it shows. So what the prison system does is it teaches literacy, numeracy and thinking skills when it could be teaching literature, mathematics and philosophy, where it would treat them as whole human beings. There's a bunch of other stuff that goes into the macho culture. The fact that we cram men into small spaces, that it's massively overcrowded. Another question later on talks about architecture of the prison system, and the fact that people are sort of, it's a low resource space where people have to fight for who they are and for respect and the way the whole and for different small little bits and bobs like cigarettes, or not that you're allowed to smoke in a lot of prisons now, but so there's so much to the reason why this sort of macho culture prevails that there's quite a lot that we need to do. But the first thing is to give people space. Well, I don't even know if it's the first thing, but a key thing is to give people space where they can genuinely articulate themselves in different ways without the constant sort of watching eye of the offender rehabilitation program, who's going to take everything they say and write it on a piece of paper and potentially increase their sentence or decide whether they should or shouldn't be let out, if that makes sense. So it's a genuine space for self-expression, which my work found was very, very rare. Sometimes in education you get it, and maybe in the chaplaincies, but it was quite a rare thing for people to have.
Thank you. A few more questions now, and I'm going to combine a couple together here for Lambros. Can reformism and abolitionism live alongside each other at all? And how do we advance abolitionist thinking in societies where legal solutions to almost every issue are so hegemonic?
Oh dear. Right. Okay. So, I mean, these are very difficult questions, as questions tend to be. So I guess I would try and make a distinction that abolitionists make between reformist reforms that extend and expand prisons or police powers or prosecutorial tactics, and non-reformist reforms, which are interventions that build things in the place of existing. So it's a tension between, I guess, a way out of or a route to further punishment. And the key question, I guess, in deciding that is to consider whether proposed reforms empower us or indeed institutions of state violence. And one thing to remember that is key here is that actually the history of legalized state-sanctioned violence in the form of punishment and incarceration actually is the history of its reform. Okay, so this is a system that has been reformed, and the harms that we see and the violence that we abhor is the outcome of that reform. So I guess what I would say is that reform changes how something is done, not what is done, or indeed what it is to be done, right? What is to be done. So on the final point of that question, or rather the separate question of, you know, what do you do in a context where you know, imprisonment, incarceration, over-policing and state violence are dominant or indeed hegemonic, as I think our fellow colleague put it, is to organize against all that, right? And organize against that, think about, you know, safety in different ways along the lines that I sort of proposed and invited us to do, and, you know, acknowledge why it is hegemonic, how it is hegemonic, and indeed what people can do in the spaces that they have with the people that they know, with the power that they have, in order to affect the change that ultimately would disempower, disarm, and disband institutions of state-sanctioned violence. But that's how I would try to put it, in full knowledge that I'm only kind of sketching out a very, very sort of broad attempt at answering the two difficult questions and pretending that that I have the sort of, final answer.
Lisa, can I just add something to this? When you studied the abolition of slavery, it was not divorced from slaves themselves. So any movement of dismantling a prison from an abolitionist standpoint has to include prisoners. Reform tends to happen from people outside that want to see it better or improve things, and I get that. But if you're talking about abolitionist positions, study slavery. There was no change within slavery and without slaves. And it was those two intersections, but everybody's written the slaves' contribution to the abolition of slavery out. And every prisoner that protests in a prison, every prisoner that kicks off is part of the abolitionist movement. They don't want to go down the block. They don't want to be subject to violence. So in some respects, that solution, there's no change without us. But once again, if you're going to go into the abolitionist position, then there's an element of risk, because those people that want to abolish stuff have to have credibility with the very same people that society doesn't like. So I would say that the politics of abolition is what people get frightened of, because you do have to form, as researchers, we're up close and personal with offenders. But I know in my own experience, when I've led dialogue groups to argue with the governor about the right to get books in a library, it's an alliance between myself, the prisoners, prison officers, and the wider community. So the way I see it, there's a consequence, because you then have to get credibility, not just in the prison, but with the constituencies out of prison that are connected to those people in prison, which makes it a community response alongside the people you're talking about in the jail. So for me, there's a clear tension, but there's a very clear position about where you sit. And depending on where you sit determines how you're going to roll on it.
Lambros, do you want to come back in there?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of echo and second what Martin said, and indeed actually thank you for that clarification, particularly because what we forget is exactly what Martin pointed out, which is actually the history of abolitionism as an intellectual and political movement actually has always involved historically the enslaved as well as people who are in prison. So if we think even radical intellectuals like Assata Shakur or Angela Davis or indeed Malcolm X have actually led their abolitionist causes as an experience of their own incarceration, or indeed as an experience of the incarceration of people who they know intimately, personally, socially, and so on. So that's a fundamental thing to say, that abolitionism isn't this sort of elitist utopian intellectual movement, but actually one that has very much been spearheaded by prisoners. Abu Mumia Jamal comes also to mind contemporarily, and many other such examples. So yeah, again, my deepest gratitude to Martin for pointing that out.
One or two more questions. Martin and Lambros, you both situated yourselves as offering a provocation, thereby almost reproducing a minority or outsider position. I was not provoked. I agree, both the need to be more inclusive and to work to disavow prisons. So I was just wondering whether you might consider that occupying the position of provocateur might be counterproductive. Might it be more radical to try to occupy the space that typically peripheralizes these positions instead?
I'll answer my side of it. I'm a Black person that's impacted historically, politically, socially based on my difference. So even when a Black person provokes, when a Black person is deemed radical, you're eradicated. So when I was at Cambridge recently, they looked at the term Black radicalism and said that what happens is when those of us feel marginalized, we have an insurrection, it's labeled as Black radical, as opposed to we've just had enough. So my day-to-day reality is constantly, whether it's walking down the street, getting stopped by the police. There's no respect for my difference in this society other than people that understand it with respect. So for me, I don't really put my lived reality, and it's a bit like what Kirstine was saying. One of the things I've learned from history, Charles Dickens left me out, Shakespeare left me out. So I can't find a period of history where I feel included. So I have to respond according to the situation I'm in. If people want to label it, whatever label you want to give it, but I live that reality. And so what I tie myself to is allegiances with people who similarly, for their own reasons, feel aggrieved that they are being marginalized. And that could be white working class people. It makes no difference. There's all sorts of people in a jail situation. And I'd say as a scholar, I'm still marginalized in the same way. So when I look at it, rather than me self-label, words like radical, what's fascinating to me, unless you've been to a maximum security prison, worked without prison officers and up close and personal with violent men, I don't see that as radical. I see that as good human relations with people who've done bad things. But some people would say that's radical. So for me, Howard Becker's labeling theory, if you apply a label to somebody like me, you're missing the point of how people like myself function in these environments. Because I don't see myself as radical. I just see myself as asserting my human rights, and I'm just not going to have the imposition of my oppression. So I agree to an extent what the person's saying, but I don't subscribe to having a label to be able to have to act to restore my sense of human rights, dignity, and respect. So, Lambros, I don't know what your thought is on that.
Lisa, could I say what Martin is very correctly saying there is that the issue of imprisonment in most countries is about the definition of whom we regard as the other. And the other in different contexts will mean different people. And if you go to any prison, any country in the world almost, and want to discover who are regarded as the other, then go and look in the prisons. In Central Europe, it will be the Roma. In New Zealand, it will be the Maoris. In Australia, with the Aborigines, and so on and so on. So it's this issue of how, the much wider sociological issue of how do we regard the other. And what we said, going back to earlier discussion, what we should not be trying to discuss, I think, is the possibility that the prison can be a place of dealing with this problem and dealing with the wider issue of recidivism, because prison is by definition a negative experience. That's what prison sets out to be. We need a much more open debate, and I think that's what many of us have been saying for the last hour. We need a much more open debate beyond the walls of the prison about who are the other and how do we create a more inclusive society.
Thank you, Andrew. We are very short of time now, folks. So for those of you whose questions maybe weren't asked, I'm quite sure our panel would take them via email. Yeah, really interesting discussion today. As people were talking, I was thinking a lot about colonialism and how that relates to criminal justice and to criminology overall. So I'd like to thank you all for taking part. I'd like to thank people for their attendance and their questions. Details of how to order our panelist books at 50% discount should be available to you in the chat and will be sent to you after the event, along with details of the next BUP webinar, which will be on disabled people's innovation for inclusive and participatory social policy on the 8th of June. Thank you very much, folks. All the best.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to be with you all.